There's incredible agility and an adeptness to his painting, but it's always in service of beauty, beauty and depth. I think that's why he was living in Santa Monica.
He used to visit down here when he was a young boy because he grew up in San Mateo, near San Francisco. And they would come down here to the beach in the summers.
And back then, Santa Monica was kind of a summer destination. What happened with my grandmother is they were on one of these vacations and she fell sick. They called the doctor, and after several days, she passed away.
So I think part of his coming back here was to sort of come back and be close to his mother. I think that was a very strong pull for him. Because of his tuberculosis, he had to live someplace that was warmer. And so when he came after his second bout of tuberculosis, when he was in the hospital in Switzerland in 1961, he came to Santa Barbara first and stayed there for a while. And then, that was a little too, it was, it wasn't really a city where you would sort of be an artist. So he started looking in the LA basin and then just gravitated to Santa Monica.
He used to always just talk about, back then it was, not as crowded and crazy as it is now, but it was a place, he said, that really complemented his art, the light, the openness. He talked about the light and his use of color and how it really, complemented his art. And, I think there's also, not as big as New York or, Paris, but there was a burgeoning art scene in Santa Monica. And so I think, he was always kind of a traveling artist. And before that, I believe he was like traveling to Europe, and he had a studio in Paris and New York, and I think he spent some time in Northern California also, and Japan, and kind of traveled around a lot. But it was interesting that when he did decide to settle down, and he chose Santa Monica.
Los Angeles, and Santa Monica particularly, still was a pretty small town. The Third Street Promenade wasn't developed. There was still like Henchy's department store on 4th and Santa Monica, opposite like a men's clothing store. And the Third Street Promenade had like, Newberry's with a counter, coffee shop that elderly people ate at. I mean, it was not fancy. It was not a fancy place, Santa Monica, at that point. And I think that really suited who he was, because he was not a fancy guy. He could be a big fish in a small pond, so to speak.
One of the beauties of being in Santa Monica was the light, the sunshine, and the ocean. That element of air and water played itself very highly in my mind with Sam Francis. So that the paintings, the trajectory of his paintings to me were the landscape that reflected that in a way.
I think there's an affinity my father had to Santa Monica, and he really put his roots down here. He really, he bought a house in the Santa Monica Canyon. He would always say that this house that I got was Charlie Chaplin's old house. I don't know who my father bought it from. I don't think he bought it directly from Charlie Chaplin, but he would always tell people, guests, when they would come over, this was Charlie Chaplin's old house. He really loved that.
He actually had Ed Jans help him design it. He had very specific ideas about studios over the years. What he really wanted was just a big open blank space that where he could just have a canvas that he could make that could just go on and on and on forever.
There was a Japanese garden in the back between the studio and the living room. And he talked about, having that Japanese influence, that Asian influence in his design. And if you look at the design, it's very kind of open, lots of natural light. And I think it's, that talking about how much he loved the light in Southern California. So if you look around the house, there's huge windows along one wall. There were skylights. There were even like at the top of the wall between the roof or the ceiling and the end of the wall, there's long strips of window. A lot of it flowed from outside in, both, with light and also movement. And then there was the pool and kind of everything built around the pool and the pool house. And then his studio itself, he did big paintings. So he wanted a big studio with high ceilings. And then he had a sleeping place on top of the studio too. So he was so entrenched in his painting and his art that a lot of times he would just lose track of time, paint, and then need somewhere to sleep or rest, afterwards. And so I think when he designed spaces, he always wanted to have somewhere to be able to crash.
I mean, his studio was definitely a revolving door of all kinds of people visiting all the time, It was one of the places that you would go to in Santa Monica if you visited, especially from overseas.
I've seen about 12 people today, yeah, they're all demanding something from me.
It was a pretty, and in that sense, it was kind of a bit of a bohemia kind of feeling of, lots of people being around. I think he kind of thrived on having that. So the house kind of had this very privateness to it, but for the people who knew, and kind of understood that like you could come over, all they had to do was just walk through the back.
He, first of all, was very, very sensitive and kind of, well, maybe sensitive is the right word, of surrounding himself with assistants and people in his life who were basically good people. They were very, very devoted people who gave their life and care to him. And that was anywhere from taking care of the kids, picking them up from a school, buying groceries. I mean, those are the menial tasks, filling the refrigerator at the litho shop with healthy food, only to throw out the next day because he never ate it, that kind of stuff. So that there was a sensitivity of what needed to be done to keep his life going as well as his creative work.
It was kind of like the most perfect place you could imagine. I was surprised always that he didn't spend more time there when I worked with him, because he was always traveling the world. He'd be in France because he had a studio in France and he had a studio in Japan. But his place at home was like really paradise.
When he got to Paris, he was still just like, had just been a student, right? He was not really unknown. When he got to Japan, he was becoming known, but he was a foreigner in a foreign land, But when he came to LA, he was the most famous artist this area had at that time, right? He had presence, he had power, he had a reputation, he had money. So at that time, he was making money. So it was a whole different way to arrive in a place and set up yourself, because he came in already with this wind behind him and with this name.
I moved to Los Angeles in 1967. Fred invited me to a reception for Yoko's first husband, Toshi Ichiyanagi, at his apartment in Westwood. And I had met Toshi in Japan briefly. So when I went, Sam Francis showed up with Mako Idemitsu at the party. And then time went by, and I became involved with the foundation of a light show in Los Angeles called the Single Wing Turquoise Bird. We were doing concerts for rock and roll bands at the Shrine Exposition Hall. And one night we were doing a projection, and I turned around, and on the scaffolding was standing Sam Francis. And one day I was hitchhiking back from Santa Monica Sears, and Sam Francis stopped in his Chrysler car to pick me up. And then very soon after that, Sam Francis took a great interest in the light show work that we were doing and became our primary and very generous patron. His patronage really affected the work of the two liquid light projections that we're working with. So Sam definitely had an influence.
So Sam, support, would go to artists' other shows. He would trade work with them. He would support them. He would do all kinds of different projects that would involve a lot of artists in the community.
Everybody sort of went through their Sam Francis phase of painting like him or taking ideas that were around, but that's like, I think, any artist with any kind of influence. You go through that and then you come to your own vision. And I think, in my eyes, Sam supported that. I had the great good fortune of working at Gemini Gel, which was a lithography workshop. And as I was leaving Gemini, these odd two men came into curating where I was working. One was wearing a straw hat, and the other one was tall, looking like a cross between Santa Claus and God. And all I could remember is that I sort of mixed Sam Francis up, who was actually working at Gemini at the time, with Francis Bacon. And he was doing a series that was there during the early 1970s, 70, I think it was. So he started hanging out there, and he took a real liking to me. And when he knew that I was leaving, he had pulled me aside and said, "Look, I want you to be my curator. I'm going away to Europe for 3 months. I'll call you when I get back." Sure enough, he called and came over and arranged for me to work with him. And at that time, I was like 22. I was very young. And it was very loose. It was very different from Gemini, insofar as Gemini was sort of at that time a mecca for all the important artists in America to come from the East Coast and begin to work on prints on the West Coast. So Sam had, in the early 70s, set up a litho shop with the help of his dealer in Switzerland. And that's where my little teeny office was.
The litho shop was, in the beginning, it was a place for Sam to just to do prints, right? He wanted to do prints when he wanted to do them, and he wanted them on his own schedule, and he really got so much out of it. But he also really helped a lot of other artists do prints and would do series for them and with them.
I knew Nancy Mosier because she was a friend of my cousin's. They went to college together, and Nancy got in touch with me and said, "I understand you're printing etchings. Sam Francis has some plates he's never printed, and he'd like them printed. So would you be interested?" I said, "Yeah, I would be interested." And he liked the work that I did. So he invited me to bring some plates to his studio. Every time that he would make an arrangement for me to come and work with him. We never worked, and we would either talk or go to lunch or go for a drive. There's this aspect of Japan that everybody's familiar with, that there's a very he immersed himself in Japanese culture, and So he had, for me as a guy in my 20s, and for him as a man in his 50s, there was the aspect of him being the master and me being the student. And so, in the old tales of like, Zen masters and their students, there's lots of tests going on. So in one way, it was an introduction and a chance for us to meet each other. In another way, I'm sure for him, he was testing me to see if we would be compatible in terms of working together. So I think the fact that he would always say, come to the studio. I mean, this would happen like about every 3 or 4 months. Come to the studio, bring plates, bring all your, solutions and your stuff and your brushes and everything, and we're going to get to work. Then I'd get there and he wouldn't be there. And I'd wait for 3 or 4 hours. Or I'd wait for 5 hours. And then he'd show up and he'd say, I'm kind of tired. I don't really want to work. And what am I going to do? I say, yeah, sure. Okay. It's not a problem.
It was very much like a working studio to a certain extent. He did do some work at the litho shop space, but he also had separate studios in Santa Monica where he mostly did his big paintings and his works on paper. And he had a studio on Ashland in Maine, sort of near the Ocean Park district, and then he had 2 different studios on Broadway in Santa Monica.
It was very rare and unusual in looking back at the community that Sam created around his life. It also had a complexity that oftentimes held a kind of lightness and darkness. And what I appreciated, and I think everyone around there appreciated, was that everybody was on a kind of equal terms in my eyes. There wasn't a hierarchy organization, and that we respected each other's realm and jobs that we had to do. We kidded with each other. The printers probably had the most disciplined job on the level of having a project, of creating a print from A to Z. But everybody else around was sort of at the whim of Sam's way that he was creative, which meant sometimes the assistants in the studio had to work at night because that's when the paintings were being done.
The whole repositioning of himself to the canvas happened both because he became ill a second time in Switzerland and because he was working on lithostones and on prints that were down below him. And so he had to think in reverse. So a painting he approached probably more intuitively, but a print he had to really think about before he, got down there and into the works with it. So I think it really changed his process.
I sort of knew about Sam in the late 70s when he was starting to develop MoCA, Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles.
MoCA came together with Sam and Robert Irwin, got themselves both on the advisory committee to set it up. And Robert Irwin said, we heard this was happening and we wanted to get our oar in the water. And Sam wanted there to be, he always wanted LA to be a more international cosmopolitan city because Sam was a cosmopolitan at heart. And he wanted them to have an international director. So he said they should hire Pontus Hultén. And Pontus Hultén had just had 3 years, I believe 3 years at the Pompidou at Paris. He was the first director there.
Pontus was, a brilliant director and a brilliant curator. He's considered one of the great museum people in the world, and Sam brought him to LA. And so the meetings before there was a MoCA building or anything, were at the litho shop. They would be in the front room while I was printing in the back. And then Sam had this idea originally that the museum would be decentralized, that there would be he said in like mini malls all over LA, just scatter them all over the city and have floating exhibitions that traveled around the city, they'd be in South LA, they'd be in West Hollywood, they'd be in the South Bay, they'd be in the Valley. Maybe there'd be like 4 or 5 hubs, you know, that so that the museum would be decentralized, so that, you know, people all over the city could, you know, in every general area, not just like a centralized location like LACMA that wasn't accessible to large groups of the city. So that was really Sam's idea as he explained it to me. But the board, you know, was obsessed with having a building, and so that it would be like a serious museum like other cities had, like, you know, MoMA or the Met or the Tate, or that it would be LA's Museum of Contemporary Art.
He met one of his old childhood friends, this master printer, on an airplane, and he just took that as a sign that there was a synchronistic event and that he should open Lapis Press.
Lapis Press was a big part of his interest in literature, love writers and poets and, you know, historians and, you know, anybody. He was very, very much interested in literature, all kinds of literature.
The idea was that Lapis would do fine art books, and it would do art livre, and it would do just, you know, books that were hard to find homes for in normal publishing houses. They also did a lot of catalogs and art books in conjunction with MoCA. So it ended up being like this publishing arm of MoCA, or at least working that way sometimes.
I started my own publishing when I was working with him, and he gave me his blessing for me to do that. And it was cool to be able to express a different side of myself, you know. But the main gig was working for him, because that was what was really, really challenging. And that's what pushed me to my limits. I mean, I worked on prints where it would take me 8 hours to make one print. I could make one print a day if I worked for 8 hours. So, you know, it's a different kind of thing. You know, it's a question of devotion. It really, I think that's another thing that the litho shop inspired in me, was that I could never have gotten anywhere else with anyone else, was a sense of daily devotion to a way of working, you know, because he wasn't there to tell you what to do. He never told you what to do. You know, the only reason I was there is because he knew that I would give it 100% every day. You know, that's the reason that he let me in, and to create an opportunity for me to give 100% every day. It's like he said, you know, when the catalog raisonné came out, he signed my copy. He wrote, you know, your hands bring magic to my images.
For him, beauty was important in the world, and exploring the universe in multiple ways. I mean, his artworks are, you know, all very much about the universe and light and infinity and space and color, which is light on fire. That was what he used to say.
He had a really strong belief in the mind-body connection and illness. And he believed that in order to be healthy and well, or even to be his truest self, he needed to integrate both the lights and dark sides of his personality. He wrote to his father and stepmother that he, you know, needed to integrate his whole self, and he needed to find a place that was where he could do that was a good climate. And so that ended up being in California. And synchronistically, because that's a term that Sam loved, you know, when he arrived here, he got involved with Hirsch and the Jungians.
The 1940s, Jackson Pollock, who was one of the premier abstract expressionists, went into Jungian analysis and worked with Joseph Henderson, and did things like active imagination drawings and drawings of the archetypes. So Sam, I think, as an art person, you know, an artist, would have been would have had knowledge of that, would have had knowledge about the influence on Jackson Pollock's paintings. Also, his time in Europe, in which Jung was alive, he might have come into the ideas of Jungian psychology. But when I started working with him, he really began to be committed to working with the Jungian analyst, James Kirsch. And all those ideas were floating around the litho shop.
The Jungian psychology actually started very early on when he was hospitalized in the late 40s in San Francisco. He started reading up more about it and studying it more. The artist David Park up in the Bay Area was also very involved with it. You know, Jackson Pollock was very involved in Jungian psychology. So there was sort of something that artists were reading about more in the 40s. And I think he just kept, you know, having that interest in it over the years, and it just would grow, you know, sometimes he was more involved with it and other times he was less involved with it. But in the 70s, there were a number of very famous analysts, people that were in actually Santa Monica. It was sort of a very big hotbed. Sam always liked to, he always had a journal with him, and especially when he was sleeping, when he woke up in the morning, he would jot down a dream right away. And he would analyze the dreams, and a lot of times they became part of his writings, his journal writings. They sometimes became ideas for artworks.
My father started having me write my dreams down. He was kind of doing this a lot, where he'll ask, what was your dream last night? And I would say, well, it was such and such. And he said, well, I think it's time for you to write your dream down. Let's keep a dream journal. So I would write my dream down and we'd talk about dreams.
I remember I was probably like 5 or 6 or 7, you know, going to a Jungian psychologist who had us doing sandbox playing and stuff like that. Yeah. And, you know, my dad would also encourage us to draw our dreams, you know, because that was our dreams are unconscious. And so, you know, by drawing them, you can get a kind of look into what's going on in your unconscious and all that. So the best part was like, he would tell us these stories when I was a young kid. And the stories had, now that I look back on it, a very Jungian kind of psychological, spiritual spin to them, or angle to them, or theme to them. Maybe that's the right word. Because there was like, in one of the characters was the shadow man, you know, and the shadow man, you could only, you know, there's the shadow in Jungian psychology, but in this story that we created together, the shadow man was just you know, he was just a shadow that was accompanying this boy and this dog on this adventure. And it influences me till this day. You know, I'm still, you know, conscious of my dreams, and you know, grateful that he opened me up to all those different psychologies and spirituality and stuff. And it's helped me in my life.
Now, one of the things that Jungian psychology does explore is the whole realm of alchemy. And alchemy, from my standpoint, provides almost a way, a role model of recognizing that there are cycles in life. So does the I Ching, the Book of Changes, that there are cycles in life of dark and light, of up and down, that keep moving, that keep going from one to another, that it isn't that you're just stuck. I mean, you might be stuck for a long time and not know how to get out, but the potential of moving from that place is seen through the alchemical process. And, you know, that was very much alive in a pragmatic, in a magical way in dealing with a creative artist, not only in working with the materials that he worked with, like in printmaking, which had to do with the tension between, you know, the solutions that needed to produce a print, but also the ways we all interacted with each other.
Jungian psychology was his religion. His whole thing was about dreams, that images came to him in dreams, and the prints we did were based on dreams. And we had an experience once where we had a dream simultaneously and talked about it the next morning, which kind of really was an incredibly intimate sort of experience to share. We both had to acknowledge at that point that, you know, we were both working in service of the muse, as opposed to it really forced us to, it's for both of us, but for him it was a big deal to really transcend any sort of ego ownership of what we were doing, because it was at a certain point we were just, you know, it sounds maybe a little new agey, but we were just, you know, in sync to the point where we were having the same dreams. For him, his painting was a bridge to open up that sort of experience in a very interesting sense. Again, not in some sort of crypto mystifying sense, but he really thought of himself as a shaman in terms of being a conduit that could just, and what his gift was with that conduit was beauty.
He didn't shy away from dealing with the darkness in a number of interesting ways. One, when you look at his self-portraits in the early 70s, you're not seeing glorious images of himself. You're seeing all the psychic elements in him, including witchery and darkness and evil, and as well as the good and the feminine that float through those pictures.
So the self-portraits, they're fascinating. I love them. I love them because first of all, they came after, the whole body of them came after the edge paintings. And the edge paintings were this big white, you know, center, right? There's nothing in the center, nothing in Ma. It was a very potent center. And Sam said the space of the center is reserved for you. When he says that, he's also saying the space in the center is reserved for me because everyone is you, right? So it's also reserved for Sam. So what does he put in the center when he starts painting again? He puts his big round head. In all those self-portraits, his big round head is in the center of the page. So I think he was putting himself back into the picture. He does them, some of them are grotesque death masks. They don't always, they look like, you know, they look comical, but they look horrific. The imagery is not itself beautiful, but the painting is. So he's sort of marrying these two, like the grotesque with beauty, you know, Beauty and the Beast, because the painting technique with that color splashed down into water and flipped into water is so luscious and vibrant, and the imagery is, you know, this often like a weird, you know, grotesque head. So I think he's marrying Beauty and the Beast in these almost in a really interesting way.
Well, I think the reason why it was good is because I knew something. I knew what you were doing.
Well, we had a good subject to talk about, too.
Right, yeah. Would you like to talk about dreams?
What did we talk about?
We talked about Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, I think.
We talked about the play The Tempest.
Tell me your dream.
My dream?
Tell me of the latest dream you remember.
Well, the most recent dream I was
He
having.
said certain things in the interview that were puzzling and high-flying comments. And one thing in particular that I wanted an explanation for. Now, we were talking about dreams and dreaming and the significance and importance of dreaming. And for Sam, who had just started analysis, I think, with James Kirsch, dreaming was a very strong motive for his personal life. I tried to suggest that dreaming played a part in his creative life in painting, but he rejected that idea. He said there was not a relationship between the two, which was quite wise of him. And So the question was, um, he said that dreams are going on all the time, not just when we're sleeping and dreaming. When we're awake, we're dreaming as well. In other words, the dream mind, the dream life was a presence in our life and worked its way to the consciousness by various methods or ways, etc. And that the same message is being sent to us all the time in this dreaming. The same message, always, whoever sending these dreams, always with the possibility that one day we might get it.
I think it's more about how he approached everything. So he wrote on a piece of paper, there are 4 things that are important: love, anguish, discipline, and the space between reality and non-reality. And so that space is the space of dreams. That space is the space of enchantment. That space is the space that art comes out of. So it's one of the 4 things, 4 most important things in his life. And I don't think, I mean, it was a space. It was a space that was a vessel that, you know, channeled visions to him. Sam said that his pictures came from rooms. Like he saw all his pictures in rooms, you know, in he had rooms inside him, and all these pictures were in rooms, and his job was to go down into these rooms and bring them forth.
Sam always loved the fly in the ointment. And I think that that was one of the biggest lessons for all of us who worked with him to take away, which was you don't reject, in some ways, the opposite. You try and understand and come into a relationship with it and recognize that it is part of an immense whole vision.
So I had the opportunity to go back to Santa Monica, back to the canyon, you know, back to the front of the West Channel house 3 years ago with my family. It was interesting when we sold the house, there was a fire at the house. It was in escrow, so it was already, you know, agreed on and everything. And then a fire broke out, and it broke out only in the studio. A lot of times I think it was, you know, my dad's spirit saying, "Oh, you can sell the house, but you're not going to have my studio." You know, I still feel strong connection when I go there. I was telling my kids, "Oh, this is where I grew up," and you know, all that. And you know, I really wish my dad was still alive to meet them and see them. But I feel like by taking them there, that they got a chance to meet him a little bit. That was a great memory. And you know, lots of good memories of my childhood still there.